Hi, this is Misha. And today I thought we'd just take a closer look and talk about the Colt SP1. Specifically, mine here was made in 1965, meaning it is 52 years old. Also meaning it and a few others are now CNR. Now, the Colt SP1 was the first semi-automatic AR15 to be available on the US market. Now, we have videos and we'll do future ones, and really Chris Bartocci is the one to talk to you about the history of the M16, so I don't want to reiterate that here and now. Just a little blurb would be that the Colt AR15 was essentially the small brother of the Armalite AR10. Armalite was founded as a research and development company in 1953, and it worked on the AR10, which lost out to the M14. Really, it was never a contender. The M14 was already a shoe-in. So they went over to the AR15 in the 223 cartridge, which was a joint project between Armalite and Remington to upgrade the 222 cartridge for military use. And as most of you know, this was mostly designed by Eugene Stoner. However, Melville Johnson, creator of the 1941 Johnson rifle and light machine gun, actually joined Armalite shortly before Stoner. So there are some Johnson designs, including the multi-lug rotating bolt that appear in this weapon. Well, Armalite, technically Fairchild, kind of forced Armalite to sell off the AR-15 design in 1959 to Colt, and so that's how it ended up at Colt. And in 1960, Stoner left Armalite himself and joined Colt. So there's a lot of early stuff with Project Agile and McNamara and Kennedy and so on and so forth about the military guns. But by the early 60s, they were getting some military interest. For example, Malaysia purchased some in full auto. The U.S. Air Force was trying desperately to get some. So it was getting a lot more attention under Colt's ownership than it had been under Armalite's. Colt really knew how to market the AR-15. In fact, they wanted to make it into a whole family. And the name was going to be the Car-15. That was the name of the family, C for Colt. In 1963, they developed a semi-automatic version, the SP1. Now, at that time, military-style guns were not very popular in the United States. People liked finely crafted sporting guns, nice bluing, ornate wood engraving on the wood and the metal. That was more the trend, and if people collected things, they tended to collect old Colts, Winchesters, old Smith & Wesson revolvers. Military pattern guns, especially then modern ones, were not desirable. Keep in mind, this is still less than 20 years after the end of World War II, and 10 years after the end of Korea. Surplus guns of all types were flooding the consumer market. There were lots of Garands, carbines, so on and so forth, and plenty of bring-back guns, say G43s and lots of Arisakas. So the military market was pretty soft at that time. It was really a new concept. In 1963, Colt would make 24 SP1 prototypes, one of which would go to the ATF for approval. However, actual commercial sales did not begin until 1964, and they began at serial number 00101. So basically they began at 101. The pre-productions would be 2 digits, otherwise we have a 3-digit serial beginning. Just as a side note, people often, when they see later production guns, they'll see a serial of SP1 and they think the 1 is part of the name. No, it's actually part of the serial. SP is the prefix for the serial and 1 is part of the actual serial number. So these early guns would actually be SP0. Now, it's not really clear if the ATF or Colt or both mandated these changes to make these guns semi-auto. Again, it was kind of a new concept. The biggest change they did, they increased the front pivot pin hole to .320 of an inch making it a larger hole. Now originally this would have a double-headed screw. I did take my screw out, I saved it of course, but I replaced it with a 601 style pin because it makes disassembly oh so much easier and just better. It means I can actually push it out. The original Colt 601s and 602s used this front push pin. They're a little different on this side, but it does have this pin does have a spring-loaded detent to keep it in the gun, so it's not just a pin stuck in there. It does have some tension. And the early military guns had a similar system, so that's why I replaced it on this gun. But that was one change they made, so a full auto upper and lower could not be mated. The other changes were internal. The rear pin is just a standard pin as we all know today. They would of course go to a trigger group modified for semi-auto. Now your early SP1s would use a full auto hammer and a modified disconnector that was once full auto. As time would go on, they would go to a semi-automatic hammer only, and they would go to a semi-automatic disconnector only. Same goes for the safety. Originally they would modify full auto safeties. Later they would make special custom, ones for these guns. And another change was to the bolt carrier. Originally, as you see, they would only cut the bottom off a little bit. Later on, they would cut it back much further, and even later, they would actually take the entire bottom off in some. While I have the carrier out, you'll notice some differences. It's a slab side, no serrations. This does have a chromed bolt. However, this carrier is parkerized, as you see. This is interesting. The pre-production guns would have an all chromed group, but the production guns beginning in '64 seem to have all had parkerized carriers. Now this is interesting. We'll get into it in a bit, but usually the SP1 would lag about 6 months behind military parts. As the 60s wore on, Colt would continually improve the parts used in the M16 to increase reliability and durability. And usually the SP1 would be built with leftover parts from, that were no longer military spec. But one thing, the early military guns all had completely chromed bolt groups. It wasn't until 1965 that the military allowed for parkerized carriers, but the SP1 preceded it. So that's one area where the SP1 had a feature before the military gun. Anyway, as you see, we have the early style machined retaining pin rather than the cotter pin. We also have the early style completely round gas key. These would both be replaced by the more conventional parts we know today pretty quickly. See, we have a chrome bolt. Oops. As I already said, the internals were originally modified full auto. One thing that I find interesting is the buffer in these. Let me eject my mag. This is an early pattern 20 round mag. It's not the early waffle, but it's still one of the earlier styles. The buffer in these original, caught my hammer, it makes it a little easier. Is what is known as the Edgewater buffer. This is a very light, solid. This is solid alloy with a movable head, an agitating head. It's a very lightweight buffer. These would be used in the early M16s and XM16E1s, but quickly replaced by the more modern buffer we know today, which is much heavier. These caused a much higher cyclic rate than was desirable in full auto. And of course, semi-auto, it doesn't really matter. So those are some internal differences. Another internal difference we really can't look at today, just because I don't want to pull my stock off. The buffer tube is the early style. It actually has holes for a wrench rather than wrench flats that we're more familiar with on ARs. So that changed. Also, the early tubes were held in with I'll flip it around, I think it's easier to see on this side. There's a roll pin running through here. So the tube was screwed in, and then a roll pin was driven through the bottom, which would cross the threads and keep it from unscrewing. They were just worried about it unscrewing during recoil. Some other early features: we have the original pattern of stock. We have a rotating sling swivel. We have a non-trapdoor butt plate. This is actually made of semi-hard rubber with serrations. The early screw does not have a drain hole. It's just a solid screw, no hole through the center. The markings on the lower would change up over time. See here. The safety on this one has the hole through it, which is an early feature. This would soon disappear. Some of the early 64 and even 65 guns would also have a similar dimple in the rear takedown pin, although mine doesn't have it here. The mag catch would change up a little bit over time as well. This, not that it matters much, but this does have the plus sign on the lower, like a military gun would have early on. Obviously no forward assist. We have the early style gas tube, which is not stainless steel, and it has a different bend to it than later style. These handguards don't have what are known colloquially as drain holes. They really weren't meant to be drain holes, but they are the earlier pattern of handguards without the so-called drain holes in the center. The front sight base is interesting. Now, the earliest M16s and even the earliest SP1s would have the cast front sight base. This isn't one of those. They quickly would go over to forged front sight bases. But this is one of the forged. It does not have a drain hole under the front sight here either. And the flashing has been machined here and on the back. Perfectly a cosmetic thing that they did early on. And this this front sling swivel isn't held in with a rivet as we know today. These had roll pins early on. Finally, we have the 3-prong flash hider, early style. This isn't the first pattern of 3-prong. This is the modified version, but this is what was in use in the mid-60s. The barrel is the 1 in 12 twist used on the 602. We are not chrome lined, and the chamber on this one is not chromed either. The earliest 601s would have a 1 in 14 twist, and a few of these 1 in 14 twist barrels would even make it onto the very first SP1s. Interestingly, the 1 in 14s I've seen, I'm not going to say they all were, but the ones I've seen were actually subcontracted to Winchester. They weren't made in-house by Colt at the time. So that gives you an idea of all the early features. Now, the XM16E1 was a test bed for new parts. It would go into the field in 1965, and they would, in the beginning, look a lot like the earlier M16s with one exception. They would add the forward assist. And then they would do things like adopt the more modern drain hole features we know. They would go to the all-parked carrier. As I said, they would get away from the original Edgewater buffer. So as time would go on, they would introduce new things to the XM16E1. it would eventually be type classified as the M16A1 in 1967. This would have the birdcage flash hider we know today. It would have the later style gas block. Forward assist was made standard, so on and so forth. The roll pin would disappear from the lower receiver. We'd go to the new style receiver extension buffer tube. One thing the M16A1 actually didn't first introduce in 1967 was what is known as the A1 buttstock. They still were building them with this solid body stock. It actually wasn't until 1970, thereabouts, they switched over to what we know as the A1 stock. But my point is, as time would go on, the military would say, we want these new parts. So Colt had to start shipping them more or less immediately with the newer parts. But they had bins of the older parts still hanging around. They would put these in the SP1s. So like I said at the beginning of the video, there's about a 6-month lag, give or take. If a new part, say the A1 flash hider, and it was introduced in early 67, it would not start to appear on SP1s until late 67. That's just an example. I'm not saying that was exactly when it was done, but you get the idea. Also, because of the military contracts and everything going on there, SP1 production was very slow in the beginning. It was not actually until 1968 that they hit serial number 10,000. Also around that time, most all of the early features would go away. You'd start to see the more classic SP1 with the birdcage flash hider, so on and so forth. So usually the guns from 64 up until the beginning of 68 will have the earlier features, and then they start to transition over. As the military ended up with enough M16s, and as Vietnam would wind down, Colt would really crank up SP1 production in the 70s. Chromeline bores would join along with the A1 buttstocks in the early 70s. And really after this, the gun would stay more or less the same until the end of production. They would introduce an SP1 carbine in 1977, and they would make it until about 1982. It was never as successful. Whereas this has a 20-inch barrel, the carbine had a 16. It used the shorter 7-inch carbine gas system, round handguards. It used the metal 2-position buttstock and carbine buffer tube at receiver extension. Otherwise, it was basically the same. It still used the same receivers without forward assist on the upper, and we're still using the early style 601, 602 slab side lower. We don't have a fence. I flipped on the wrong side. Sorry, guys. We don't have a fence here. We're still using the front pin. Still using the double-headed screw. See, the mag catch is just exposed. Military guns would have gone away from this exposed mag catch very early, 1964, early 65, because they would go to the more modern takedown pin, the self-contained, the captured pin, and that would lead a lip here going across the top. Then they would add a full fence going around 2 more sides soon after that for the A1. But the SP1s kept on using the older style of receiver. I'm not sure why. They weren't just using up old stock. I suspect it's just because this pattern worked. It was approved by the ATF, and Colt didn't want to rock the boat by introducing a new pattern to lower and risk losing ATF approval. So they just kept on making these lowers all throughout the 70s and into the 80s. So they made the carbine for about 5 years. They kept on making the rifle. These would go out of production, at least they would start to disappear from the Colt catalog around 1985. And of course, old stock would be sold off for a year or two after that. You could still find them new in 86, for example. Now, the late production SP1s, very late, would start to gain some M16A2 features like the round handguards. But for the most part, the guns would remain unchanged after the early 70s. Now, Colt would make a large number of these. It was about 350,000. And over a 20-plus year production run, you get the idea. Even if the first 3 or 4 years were pretty slow production. Well, on the table, I just brought out a few accessories, nothing major. I've got an early style mag pouch. This actually was just a general purpose mag pouch, but it worked for holding 4 20 round magazines, but it's a little too deep. So what a lot of soldiers did, they would put socks or something else, cleaning gear or whatever, in the bottom. And I just rolled up some socks myself in here to keep my mags from sitting too deep. But early on they would use these general purpose pouches. Later they would actually go to, of course, specifically built for the M16 pouch once it was more common. I was looking for it before I started this video. It's in one of my boxes. For the cleaning kit, they would issue these with cleaning kits quite early on in military, but since the stock was solid body, it would be stored in the same belt pouch as the clip-on bipod. There was a light clip-on bipod which would go on the barrel. So these would have cleaning kits. This is just a standard bayonet. It's pretty much derived from World War II Korean style carbine Grand bayonets, but it's just modified. It's an M7 to work with the M16 AR15 type guns. It uses the same lug as the later M9s and stuff we still use today. This may at end will still fit on a modern M4 carbine. I just brought some stuff out to have it on the table as usual. Yeah, just thought we'd share the SP1, kind of talk about it. I think these are neat guns. Trigger's a military trigger, but the bolt is very smooth on this one, these early guns. These are great guns. They're finally starting to get collectible, but with 350,000 or so out there, and a lot were used by police departments too that didn't want to issue full autos, so they would issue these. I grew up with an SP1. My father had one, and so he kept it under the bed, and I remember him having it, and I'd shoot it as a kid, and it was really interesting to me then. It was the gun of Rambo. That was the era when First Blood came out, and I remember just thinking it was a Rambo style gun. It's the best thing I could identify it with then. So I've always thought the SP1 was interesting and always had to have one. I've pretty much owned one since the beginning, but as I would find better examples, I would upgrade. So I've gone through 4 or 5 different SP1s over the years, you know, as I found better examples, and I'm probably sticking with this 65. It's about as early as I could find, and I like the early ones because having slab side is correct for a quasi Colt 602 or XM16 early Air Force gun clone. When you get to the later ones that have the A1 features but still have the slab side, upper, lower, it's kind of an, you know, inconsistency. It's not really accurate for any type of clone. I did have a Colt SP1 carbine, but ultimately that's why I sold it, because it wasn't really fish nor fowl. I replaced it with a Troy XM177, and I've been very happy with it. But I still have my Colt, of course, and I do have an M16A1 build back when those uppers were very affordable from the National Guard, so that appears in other videos. Well, we'd love to hear your own SP1 stories, hear you talk about your own guns, or post pictures. If you have any comments or questions, please post them below. If you liked the video, please click like. And if you haven't already subscribed and could, we'd really appreciate that. And again, this is just about the SP1 specifically. We have other videos on the history of the M16. And yet again, if you really want some good info, check out Chris Bartocci's channel, because he's used to work for Colt and has had a lifelong passion for these weapons. He too grew up with the SP1. I think it was his neighbors, but we have kind of similar stories there. Well, as always, this is Misha. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.